people would say, this is terrible, Yafa, we sympathize with you, but you're strong. And that hit me a little bit because I'm like, yes, but no, in this incident, I'm not strong. Right now, it's my mom who is in prison. So I don't even have to be strong for that. It's okay not to be strong.
Welcome to the Yalla Let's Talk show / podcast. Today we have Yafa Jarrar with us, where we're going to have some helpful but very fun conversations. So Yafa is a Palestinian Canadian labor and employment lawyer. She has been involved in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement since 2005. And Yafa's mother, Khalida Jarrar, is an elected member of the Palestinian Legislative Council and was a political prisoner in an Israeli prison. Over the years, Yafa has seen the violent arrests of her parents, both of whom were political prisoners in Israel for many years. Yafa is an outspoken individual coming from a family of activists and advocates, and has never shied away from condemning the Israeli occupation and apartheid over Palestine, and often speaks for Palestinians all around the globe. Above all, Yafa is a genuinely awesome person and a dear friend of mine. So please welcome Yafa.
Thank you so much, Hani, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here.
So you lived under an occupation in Palestine. How would you describe living in Palestine versus transitioning and moving to Canada?
So this is a beast of a question. I'll try to address it as brief as I can. I moved to Canada in 2003, and I was 17 at the time, so don't do the math because that's just going to tell you how old I am right now. And I came by myself. I came on a scholarship to attend Lester B. Pearson College of the Pacific, which is one of the colleges that's part of the United World Colleges. They had the IB program. At the time, the IB program wasn't as popular as it is today. So my teachers and principal at the school that I was at in Palestine, I live in the city of Ramallah in Palestine. They approached me and encouraged me to apply. So I applied, and there's a selection committee, and anyway, I ended up being selected to attend, and I chose Canada as the country to attend.
So why did you choose Canada?
So that's another story actually that's funny.
Tell us.
The rules, so basically this competition was done amongst many Palestinian students in high school. And they were gonna select 10 people in general to send them to 10 different United World Colleges around the world, right? At the time, I believe 12 of them around the world. Canada was one of the countries. Now, in the application, there's an exam, an application, all of that. They ask you to list your preferences as to where you wanna go. And depending on how you score, the top person will get their first choice. The second person will get their, second and what have you, and then the rest will be assigned. So in the application, I put my first choice, United States, my second choice, Italy, and my third choice, Norway. I didn't put Canada at all. And when we've gone through the whole interview process and exam, it was a long process. I was told by the Ministry of Education that I scored first. So I was like, great, I'm going to America, right? Because as a 17-year-old at the time, that was the dream.
It's the American dream.
Exactly, is to go to the US. Now, they called me and said, congratulations, you're going to Canada. And I said, I'm confused. You said if you score first, you get your first choice. And they said, well, there have been some technical issues. They came up with this excuse, didn't make sense to me. I find out later. So I didn't really question it. I was like, okay, I guess I'm going to Canada. I kind of was a little bit upset, actually. Years later, I find out that my dad actually, behind my back, told them, under no circumstances I'm sending her to the United States. And I'm only gonna, agree to Yafa going only if she goes to Canada.
Wait. Why did he not want you to go to the US?
Okay, so my dad's never left Palestine in his life because he was a political prisoner for many years, and as part of a collective punishment, Israel doesn't allow him to travel, and that's a punishment that many Palestinians face. So he's one of those people. He's never left Palestine. I think he thought I would have a better quality of life in Canada. He kept going and going on and on about the welfare state and the healthcare system and all of that kind of stuff. The aspects in Canada that now we're fighting to make better or keep even that are under threat. So from his perspective, first of all, for both my parents to send a 17-year-old by myself to go for 2 years to live somewhere else that we have zero connection to, and they are not allowed to travel, so they can't hop on a plane and come visit me, is a very challenging thing. Mm-hmm. But they really wanted me to go at the time because it was during the second Intifada in Palestine. And most of the time, my city and other cities in the West Bank were under complete military invasion by the Israelis. We used to actually I used to climb behind walls and through the backyard to get to school because there would be soldiers on the street. So we would sneak in to get to school safely. So they wanted me to have a safer, better way to receive my education. Okay. And Canada was the acceptable place for them.
So for your parents, it was more about what they perceived to be a safe place, and they saw Canada to be that. I do agree Canada is a great place to be. So, props to mom and dad. You mentioned a few things, and the question I was asking was about how is it like to live under an occupation, and you already touched on it as a collective punishment for people who are in prison. They cannot travel. Can you tell us a little more about your experiences living in Palestine?
Right. So usually when I get this question, or at least when I first moved here, it was a confusing question because that's the only life I knew. So when people told me, tell us how it's like to live in Palestine, it's the only thing I knew, and for me it was normal. So again, things like going through military checkpoints on a regular basis is just part of our life, right? That's something that we do. There's an Israeli military checkpoint between every city and village and every village and village in Palestine. You can't drive for more than 40 minutes in a car without being stopped and asked.
What exactly is a checkpoint?
A checkpoint basically is a military kind of temporary or permanent base for Israeli soldiers who are fully armed to stop Palestinian cars or pedestrians, check for their IDs, and many times they would arrest people at checkpoints, right? The whole purpose of them, Israel justifies it as a security measure. I'm not sure security for whom, but the only thing that checkpoints do is to just keep Palestinians under complete military control. And to continue with their apartheid policies and to keep us fragmented from each other.
Okay, and so that's a way for them to have a control and continue to oppress the Palestinians. Yeah. I want to know, is this the same, does this rule apply to Israelis? Do they have checkpoints as well? No. So it's just for Palestinians, okay. I wonder why people still do not consider this an apartheid.
Yeah, and I mean, now it's much, much harder for people to reject the idea, or not the idea, the fact that the Israeli regime as it exists today is an apartheid regime. And when we talk about it this way, that's exactly it. Your question, does this apply to everybody or just Palestinians? This is a very simple yet accurate way to describe apartheid. It's a legal system where the practices of that system apply to certain people and not others based on their race, religion, nationality, etc. So it's rooted in racism. It's rooted in discrimination. And checkpoints is just one example that actually demonstrates that apartheid does exist, and it is apartheid.
And I like how you just said it's one example of many examples. And as a Palestinian growing up there, having parents who are activists and advocates for liberation, I want to know more about the trauma as a young Palestinian, a girl, seeing all of this growing up.
I don't think there's any Palestinian or Palestinian household that hasn't experienced trauma because of living under Israeli occupation and apartheid. And by that, I also include Palestinians who live in Israel proper, who are Israeli citizens, and that 20% of the Israeli population are Palestinians who still live in the so-called Israel proper, or we call it the 48 areas. So Yafa, for example, the city that I'm named after, is in 48. I'm not allowed to go to Yafa. My name is Yafa, but because I carry a West Bank ID, a green ID, I'm not allowed, Israel doesn't allow me to go to Jerusalem or to Yafa and what have you. So basically, when I say trauma applies to everybody, it applies to also Palestinians, not just in the West Bank or Gaza, but also to Palestinians in the diaspora, Palestinian refugees, Palestinians who were born to parents who come from the diaspora and never been to Palestine.
Absolutely, because you see it in survivor's guilt.
Absolutely.
You know, them trying to help. And even when it comes to social media, like I remember even just seeing what the events that happened in May of 2021, where people were going to IG Live on a lot of content creators, and they're actually seeing the explosions happen, and they're having secondary trauma from those experiences. So it's definitely something that affects not just the people there. Obviously, it affects them in a higher proportion, and there's no question about that. But everyone is affected at the end of the day.
Absolutely, and this is what is referred to as intergenerational trauma. So similar to the Indigenous people in Canada, who you have a lot of Indigenous people who didn't go to residential schools, for example, but they still experience the intergenerational trauma that their ancestors and grandparents and parents have gone through. So trauma is born, can be born and also experienced firsthand or passed down through intergenerational trauma. And, for us dealing in Palestine, again, this is the only thing that I knew prior to coming here. So having to stop for checkpoints and improve my ID was a normal, or is still, a normalized act, even though nothing about it is normal. Being waken up in the middle of the night by a bunch of completely and fully armed military soldiers with M16s and machine guns pointed at you while you're in your bed, taking your mom or your dad to prison. That was part of my everyday life in Palestine. So I didn't know anything about it. I didn't even know it was trauma until I came to Canada. And I remember one of my first shocks was, first of all, the massive amount of space there is in Canada.
In Canada. I was going to ask you what surprised you about it when you came here.
Secondly, the first time I ever crossed by land from in a car, one province to the next, I believe we were driving from Alberta to Saskatchewan. And my previous partner at the time was driving, and he goes, Yafa, we're about to enter Saskatchewan, And I reached to get my passport. And he looks at me and he says, what are you doing? And I said, oh, isn't there a checkpoint? So, that was one of the, I think for him too, one of the most fundamental examples of, because he was shocked too that I thought that I was expecting to face a checkpoint just because we're entering a new province. So, this is slowly when you start being in another place like here or anywhere else in the world that's not under military occupation. Then I started, realizing, wow, like nothing about the life that we live. And I mean, we always knew it was violence. We always knew it was military occupation. We've always, longed for liberation and freedom, but didn't really understand what freedom meant, really what freedom is, until I experienced it here.
I love that. I love the fact that you have one experience and one lived experience, and when you came here and you thought it was normal when you were back in Palestine, and then you came here, you realize, no, that's not okay. And I think if people start kind of like looking at it and empathizing in the way that, let's imagine like this is, let's say Canada is Israel, right? And we cannot go to a single place without our passports, or we're going to have some random people, or not random, the military come in and knock on our doors in the middle of the night, when we have that fear that our family might go to jail every single day, when we see people lose their lives in front of us, then we can start to empathize that this is not okay. Just because we're in one part of the world versus another, it doesn't justify anything.
Yeah. And if you look at history, the very similar stuff has happened in previous apartheid regimes. Like if you look at South Africa, Black South Africans during South African apartheid, there were many areas that were restricted from entering, and they had to show passes, right?
Yeah.
So after certain hours, if the apartheid police stops them, or military persons stop them, they have to show a pass, they have to show a permit that they're allowed to be in that place at that time. And if not, they will be punished, right? Mm-hmm. So if you look at the situation in Palestine, it's the exact same. Even our IDs are different colors, representing which geographic location you come from. And if this is not legal discrimination, I'm not really sure what is. And about the normalization, Hani, just quickly, you just reminded me of a story about my sister when she was really, really young. She actually believed, because she was crying one day and she went to my mom and she said, I don't want to go to prison. I don't want to go to prison. And my mom said, why do you keep thinking that you're going to prison? And she thought, she actually believed that it was going to prison. It was a rite of passage everybody has to go through at some point when they become an adult.
That's wild. Like, to think that a child will think that's normal, and it's like you said, a rite of passage.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show the trauma that we face, or the Palestinians face, back under the occupation and apartheid. I want to just transition this conversation into something you told me before, mm-hmm. and that's when you came here. You didn't know English. You had to learn English, and you didn't really know anybody. You said that your parents didn't even have any ties to coming to Canada. Mm-hmm. So how was it like integrating in Canadian society?
Okay, So I was, the one different thing about me coming than perhaps most newcomers or immigrants coming to Canada is that I came to an international college, right? So Lester B. Pearson College, United World College is an international campus. At the time, there was 200 students from 88 countries. Now, the majority were Canadian because we're in Canada, but we also had people from all over the world, or students from all over the world. So that made it a little bit easier for my transition because there were Arabs that I connected with and I could speak Arabic with. I got along a lot with Latin Americans, with, different kind of nationalities.
And I love that, because what you're saying here is that when it comes to integration, you need people that you can actually connect with, right? There's a social integration, and different cultures and different ethnic communities can still make it seem like a sense of home.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I was very in a intense cultural shock and homesickness the first few months of coming to Canada. Like I remember crying a lot. I remember my English, we learned English in school and it was decent, but not conversational like it is today. I wouldn't be able to, just express my thoughts, carry on with my tasks or whatever I needed easily. Mm-hmm. I always had to make an effort, an extra effort, let's say. So that was frustrating. And I remember I didn't speak to that many people at the time because I was homesick and because I wasn't comfortable with the language. So that was difficult. But I think, as you mentioned, being surrounded by other folks who were in the same position as well, right? Like it was their first time leaving home. We were all the same age. That really helped.
And this goes back to showing like the resilience of this. And, you may not be there right there and integrated, but as time goes, you start to, developing these friendships and integrating. I want to go back into just talking about law school. So you're a lawyer right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we went to law school together.
We did, yeah.
Yo, high five. How's your Ottawa experience?
Congratulations.
Yo, congrats.
Alhamdulillah, salamat.
I know, Allah Yaslamik.
Yeah.
The stuff that we learned in law school.
Oh my gosh. It feels like ages ago, but it wasn't that long ago.
It has been a while. Yeah, you're right. Now I'm just thinking I'm getting some flashbacks. It's there's one story that I always remember, and this was in first year of law school. And essentially what ended up happening was there was this moot.
Oh yeah.
That in law school, so a moot is like a mock court. For those that don't know, that encourages law students to act like they are fully licensed lawyers and advocate for a case. And it's like a mock case. And then you have judges and everything.
Yeah.
And I remember that Yafa took part in this competition and you had a partner. And everyone usually does this with a partner. And Yafa's partner dropped out from my recollection. And if I tell you how brilliant Yafa advocacy skills were, like mashallah, that was awesome. And she made it all the way to the finals. Yeah. And I still remember, like, it was such an iconic moment because that was the first time that I saw Yafa and met Yafa. I think it was the first time I met you.
Yeah.
And it just shows resilience. Like, you still powered through, you didn't have a partner and you still did a brilliant job. Can you tell us your experience just in general in law school and how you were able to just keep bouncing back up?
Oh my goodness, it was tough, to be honest. So thank you for reminding me. That was one of the toughest years of my life, actually, because I had just started law school, and as you know, and many people know, it's a very tough program. Like you have to be really fully there and committed, and it's a tough program. My mom had just been imprisoned for the first time shortly before I started first year law school. So we were still, it was something, we're starting a new program, new people. It wasn't something that I could talk to people around me and that kind of stuff. So
you started law school
in
Ottawa, in Canada.
Yeah.
Your mom was just imprisoned as a political prisoner in Israel.
Yeah.
And law schools are like, for anyone who has been to law school, you can appreciate how mentally difficult that is. So to have that going on at the same time, how were you able to balance and cope and succeed and exceed?
Yeah, it was tough. I honestly don't know, but I don't know how I did that, but I think that's been part of my journey since I got here. Every time I felt, even whether it be in Pearson or law school or when I did my master's or when I was in my undergrad, every time I felt, I can't do this anymore, there's something in me that kind of said, the Zionists and the Israeli entity wants us to fail. And Palestinians are known for valuing education very much because it's part of, it's kind of part of our liberation, to be, committed and to education, but also to value education. And so there's something that comes to me and says, no, they want you to fail, and then that would kind of fuel me to do more or to pass that period where I'm feeling really overwhelmed. So
it's your passion for a cause and for the Palestinian liberation, and just kind of knowing that this is something that's gonna help you achieve that objective.
It was a challenge too. Like for me, I took it as a challenge because I knew that, again, for Israel, they would love to see Palestinians not educated, not accomplished. They would love that, right? Like there's nothing more that they would love. So to me, it was a challenge. It was part of me taking part of the liberation of Palestine, if that makes sense.
It does, it does. And I just want to clarify, when you say Israel, what do you refer to in this conversation?
I'm referring to the whole entity, the whole state, the system, the everything, the Israeli entity as an entity, as an apartheid state, their policies, the way that they operate and on stolen Palestinian land and continue to oppress the indigenous Palestinian people, and not just that, ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from their homes.
And I'm happy you clarified that. And I do agree that when it comes to right now, when we're looking into in politics, and we can criticize states and we can criticize their policies and we can criticize the governments. And for us, even if when you're in Canada or in the US, we want to improve the world. We want to improve the systems and dismantle, systematic barriers and racist systems. And I think you represent that so beautifully and eloquently. Khalida Jarrar, a Palestinian icon, and also your mother.
Yeah.
And I want to just ask, how has seeing your mother's role in politics as well as in prison changed the way you see the world?
It's really impacted me. I want to say my mom's imprisonment impacted me, impacted my sister, impacted my father fundamentally, as well as many people, right? My mom is very well loved. She's a figure for people, for gender equality. She's a feminist, she's a secular, she spent all of her life working for Palestinians and for political prisoners and all of that kind of stuff. So it was tough. The way that it changed my view about the world, I mean, the difference between witnessing my mom being arrested is that I was older. I was a full adult, in law school. I wasn't a child anymore, like when they used to come and take my dad. And my dad spent in total 11.5 years in prison and was tortured, and the Israeli soldiers would beat him up in front of us as children, as kids, when they would come and arrest him from our house. That trauma is different for when you experience something similar as an adult. And, I thought I would take it easier because we're used to this, quote unquote. We're used to this. But no, it hit me differently, because now I fully understand and realize that there is nothing normal.
It's not okay.
It's not okay, right? And it made me realize how unfair the world can be and how cruel the world can be. And it also showed me how far Israel can act with impunity and go and do and commit these crimes against the Palestinian people without accountability and without the international community holding them accountable or doing anything about it.
And you're seeing this and experiencing the sense of injustice while you're in law school as well in Canada.
Yeah.
And how do you find reconciling that? Like seeing kind of like the Canadian justice system versus, a system that, quote unquote, suggests that it is, more advanced as a government. Yeah. How do you reconcile that?
So, first of all, my decision to go to law school came, partially was because of everything I've experienced in my upbringing and living under occupation and all of that kind of stuff. With the full realization and understanding from me that I'm going to law school just to get the tools to kind of continue with the work that I do and my commitment to the liberation of Palestine and oppressed people in Palestine and around the world, right? So here I want to refer to Audre Lorde's famous saying that you cannot use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, right? So when we talk about the Canadian legal system, yes, it's much, much fairer and more just system than when we talk about the Israeli, it's not, I'm going to put it in quotations, legal system or justice system, because there's nothing legal or just about it. That's why I put it in quotation marks. Against the Palestinians, of course, it's way, there's no comparison.
Yeah.
But we have to remember that you and I, Hani, studied common law, right? We also studied a law that's rooted in colonialism, that is a product
Facts.
of colonial legal structures in a country that's also a settler country, which is Canada, because this is also a country that's built on Indigenous lands, and there were other legal systems that existed and still exist, many different ones that have been now replaced by the colonial legal systems, right? So all of these, I think, are important things to realize. And I went to law school with that full realization. And again, getting this education and as a tool to pursue and continue with my commitment to the Palestinian liberation.
I love that. And I love the fact that you acknowledge the fact that we are indigenous land, on indigenous lands.
Yes.
And I want to just know more about how do you also reconcile the fact that you are an indigenous land, you are living in a settler country, and also you come from an indigenous place. How do you kind of like reconcile those two different facts about your situation?
When I first started learning about indigenous history in Canada and the colonial history in Canada and residential schools and what have you, to be honest, I had a little bit of a crisis, of an internal crisis, that I am benefiting and being in a role of a quote unquote settler, doing, basically that puts me in a similar situation as an Israeli in Palestine. It didn't sit well with me. And I made the decision to study Indigenous studies in Trent University at the time for that reason, because I just couldn't. So I learned about the history here as much as I could. And then I started doing work around Indigenous solidarity as much as I could. Because again, as oppressed people, as Palestinians, we don't live in a vacuum. Oppressed people around the world must and have to be in solidarity with each other, right? We cannot pick and choose which oppressions we wanna support, right? So being and benefiting from the colonialism here made me just committed more to learning and also doing as much as I can to be an ally, and not just to be a passive earner of colonialism in Canada, just to be a beneficiary. I didn't want to just be a beneficiary of these, even though we all are. So that was a little bit challenging for me to reconcile. And then the more I learned, the more it became clear to me my role and what my responsibilities are.
Absolutely. Do you know what I find interesting? So I grew up for the most part here in Canada, and I never knew about the Indigenous history up until law school.
Wow.
To think about that, right?
Wow.
It wasn't in our education system. So I was just, growing up passively thinking that, Canada came and was established, and there was, the Indigenous people, but now everyone's integrated. It was like this happy, like euphoria, is that the right word?
Yeah.
Kind of like situation. But when we came to law school and we learned about residential schools and we learned about the dark history in Canada, it does put, I wouldn't, what is the word? It's a responsibility, right? That's what privilege is, right? We all have it.
Yes.
And it's how we use that privilege to advance society and to do better. And what I appreciate about you, Yafa, since I've met you and since I've known you, you've always been doing some great things for the community, whether it's advocating for Palestine. And right before that, you were telling me in law school, you used to volunteer in a safe house. Yeah. And can you tell us a little more about that experience and what did you learn about yourself through that experience?
Right. So I did work, volunteer work for harm reduction. So there was kind of a group that started up in Ottawa during the overdose pandemic, right, of a lot of people overdosing and dying, basically. So that's why it's referred to as a pandemic, because it was, and it still is in some parts of the world and in Canada. So I started doing work, and that wasn't the first time, by the way. Even when I moved to Canada in 2003, I did work in Sanctuary City in Vancouver, in East Hastings. I did harm reduction work there as well. So I became involved in harm reduction work, safe injection sites, and what have you, and doing that type of work. In law school, it also made me deploy what I'm learning into something more concrete.
I like that. And I want to just go back into something. I want to ask you, how do you define resilience? Because that is the overall theme right now. How do you define resilience right now?
It is so difficult to find like a word or a sentence to describe it. But for me, resilience is the ability to, as an oppressed person, the ability to be involved in activism, in fighting oppression, in all of these things, and at the same time, being able in safe settings and other settings to also be vulnerable, to also be sad, to be human, to be burnt out, to be depressed. So those two things can exist together, right? And I think because we cannot pretend that resilience is only just being strong and always being strong. Nobody can just always be strong if they continue to experience injustice, right? Like that, just they would be a superhuman, and I have never met someone like that. And to claim that resilience is always connected to strength, I think is an inaccurate description. So being able to kind of live both and be both, being able to go to a demonstration, let's say, organize, do the work, and then also be able to love and live and party and have, you know, the other side of being human. This balance is very difficult to achieve. And I think for me, achieving that balance, which I'm still learning how to do, is the definition of resilience.
I love that. And if there's like a takeaway from this conversation right now, I really hope that people remember this. It's being human, letting yourself experience everything and still pushing forward.
Yes.
And that's something I think you embody so beautifully. And I want to just ask and dive deeper into that. Is that, so you mentioned that you're still learning how to become more resilient day by day. But for someone who is going through something or they have an experience right now, what is it, one piece of advice that you can give them?
That it's okay not to be strong, that it's okay not to feel okay. Absolutely okay. And it's part of the journey. And I think we need to be less harsh with ourselves. It is, what's not okay is to pretend that, or to live life without kind of the interest or the curiosity about knowing or wanting to know. That is, in my opinion, that's not okay. But, you know, and I'm not expecting everybody to like become an activist, because activism also takes many different shapes and forms. This is what we're doing here is a form of activism. So activism can take many, many, many different forms, right? And people can experience it and do it in whichever way that they want. So it's okay to not feel okay, and it's okay to seek help. Like it's okay to, I'm a big advocate of therapy, especially for people who experience trauma and PTSD. And I know there's stigma around mental health and all of that kind of stuff, but we can't continue. We cannot actually be productive if we don't take care of our mental health. And this is something that what I meant, I'm still working on and trying to, because I haven't mastered that skill and that ability, and I'm always learning and I'm always making mistakes.
And I love how humble you are about this stuff, because like for someone like myself, seeing you, you know, you are this, you know, strong, independent human who's accomplished so much and continues to accomplish, and is has also become kind of like, as in the same light as your mom, a symbol for Palestine and fighting oppression. At the same time, knowing that you're still a human being and you're still coping and struggling just like everyone else.
Oh, yeah.
And I think when we start to understand that everyone has their own story and their own, it's when we become less harsh on ourselves as well.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's, yeah. And that's actually one of the misrepresentations or misunderstandings when people meet me or when they see me. They'll be like, oh, you're strong. So when something bad happens, like when my mom gets arrested or what have you, people would say, this is terrible, Yafa. We sympathize with you, but you're strong. And that hit me a little bit because I'm like, yes, but no, in this incident, I'm not strong. Right now, it's my mom who is in prison. So I don't even have to be strong for that. It's okay not to be strong. Mm-hmm. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to cry. It's okay to be depressed about it. So even strong people or strong appearing people and strong people, you know, they also feel weakness and feel sadness. Absolutely. And I think we need to embrace that. There's nothing wrong about that. This is actually part of...
We're human.
Yeah, we're human.
We're human. And I love the fact that you acknowledge that and you embrace it, and you use that to empower you. And I want to go and I want to talk about something. And I know last year you've experienced loss with your sister passing. Mm-hmm. And I want to know, how is it like experiencing loss?
Oh, I lost my sister Suha July 11th of 2021, and it's nothing like I've experienced before in terms of, you know, we went through violence and arrests and loss. I've experienced loss before, but losing my sister was something else. It's I can easily say the hardest thing I've ever been through, and I continue to go through that hardship. And especially that she passed while my mom was in prison, and I was here and she was in Palestine, so that made it even, just brought it into a completely different level of an experience. Yeah.
You were in Canada. Your mom was still in prison at that time.
Yeah.
And from what I remember reading in the news, they wouldn't even let her have a compassionate visit.
Yeah.
And your mom wrote a beautiful poem that, and I wish I had the poem right there, but can you share that experience and what that trauma also felt like when you were there?
So I also couldn't attend the funeral because at the time my Palestinian passport was expired and I didn't have my Canadian citizenship yet, even though I've been here since 2003. I received my citizenship a few months after, and then I was able to go. So, and my mom was in prison and we have no way of communicating because we can't call them. They don't have phones or anything. The only way to communicate with my mom while she's in prison is through the radio, which is something Suha and I used to do every Friday morning. I would wake up super early Friday morning and call into the radio station back home, which is the only radio station that they can listen to in prison. And there was a prisoners' families program on the radio station every Friday. So families of prisoners, of Palestinian political prisoners, and we have over 6,000 of them, would call in and just say their news to their loved ones inside prison. So Suha and I and my dad, every Friday, that was our routine every Friday, is to call.
What did you tell your mom at that time?
So she had found out before because it was all over the news. It was all over the news in Palestine and in many parts of the world when she passed. So unfortunately, she heard on the radio before the lawyer or the prison administration could tell her. And I don't want to imagine, now that I'm a mother, as of 6 weeks ago.
Congrats, by the way.
Thank you. And actually, my daughter was born July 14th, 2022. My sister passed away July 11th, 2021. So almost exactly a year after Suha passed. My daughter, Celia Suha, was born. So I feel there's something there. But until I became a mother myself, I didn't know there's no way I would have known what it would feel like to lose a child. And especially being under those circumstances inside Israeli prisons. But from what my mom told me, the other women political prisoners, they were extreme because they also knew Suha. So, from visits and from the radio. And they basically, the way that they showed up for her was absolutely amazing.
It's tragic to know that something like that happened, and someone couldn't go and have a visit. At the same time, it just shows the sense of community wherever we go, whether it's in prison or whether it's in schools, and people showing up.
Absolutely. And even the way people showed up for me after Suha passed, and for my father, it's overwhelming in a very good way. And honestly, it's partially how we're able to continue today. I still ask I ask myself this question every day. I don't, Suha and I were inseparable. We were more than sisters, really. It was part of me died, really.
I hear you, and my condolences. And
Thank
I remember Suha. The first time we actually did meet, and we were just talking about this, wasn't at the moot. It was when we were at like a pre-law school party or event. And we were all having a good time. And Suha was so full of life and just a good time. And I do remember, I think the first question I asked you guys was, are you twins? Because you guys look so much alike, and you have very similar
that's true. And actually having Suha there with me in first year law school is what got me through law school. And speaking of the moot, when I made it to the final, actually for the moot itself, I didn't own a suit, right? So I didn't have a suit. And
the realities of first year law school. Now, how many suits do you have?
Many. I didn't have a suit, and I remember I didn't have time to go shop for a suit. I also didn't have that much money, and Suha either. So I remember Suha because I was studying or preparing or something. I didn't have time. I was stressed out. I said, I don't know what I'm gonna wear. And she ran to the Rideau Center in Ottawa, and she bought me a suit and a shirt. So what I was wearing is what Suha got me.
That is so nice.
And
it goes to show her character as well. And your relationship between the both of you. And I remember after her passing, you celebrated her life. You created an event. Can you tell us a little more about that event and why you decided to honor her memory that way?
We created celebrations of life for Suha, multiple ones. And I chose to call it Celebration of Life, which is not something we do as Arabs, when someone dies, and, it's more of we call it a mourning house. We mourn. And I mourned. And we do mourn our dead, and we should, But I also wanted to create a celebration and do the things because Suha loved life so much. And I knew this is what she would have liked. So she loved seafood. So I've never met someone who loves seafood more than she does. Actually, it was a problem for her how much she loved seafood.
Seafood's good.
So we got oysters and everything that she loves, crabs, and and had a celebration of life where people talked about Suha, remembered Suha, how she wants to be remembered, and how and we had one in Palestine as well. And people came and sang, and Suha used to also dance with the pose with the fire, and we had a pose performance. Her workplace, she worked at Al-Haq, Human Rights Organization, Al-Haq in Palestine. And her work organized also another celebration of life for her, where donations were gathered for the Humane Society for animals, because Suha loved animals as well, you know. Her cat Ajwe, still
Ajwe, what a nice
Ajwe,
name.
yeah, he still lives with my parents, and he's so attached to my mom and dad now, but it was very attached to her. So we did the things that Suha loved, and for us this was a way of coping kind of with her loss, even though there isn't really an easy way to cope with that kind of loss.
And that was going to be my next question, is that how does someone, because I don't think you can ever really recover from loss, but how does someone cope with loss?
Yeah. Grief never goes away, ever. And it never gets smaller. So imagine grief, and this was a helpful way for me. Because for me, you know, I still go to therapy, and I think everybody should go to therapy.
Absolutely.
And I went to grief group sessions where, and that really helped as well, where people who also lost loved ones share their stories and that kind of stuff. And the most useful thing for me to kind of understand grief, because, you know, people would say it would get easier with time. It's not that it gets easier. It's not that you forget. It's not that you get used to it. All of these are misrepresentations of how grief happens. Let's assume grief is a circle this big, and you are the square around it. The circle stays the exact same size, but the square around it is the one that gets kind of bigger. And that's really how it feels, because the intensity is still the same.
I like that visualization of it, because it's not that the grief and the pain goes away, is that there's a lot of things surrounding it, and your other lived experiences, and, you know, new life, you know, being born as well.
Yes.
But you still have to every day still have, like, it's still, you still live with it and navigate your life.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a very healthy perspective of looking at it. And I just want to say, like, once again, that just hearing your conversation and hearing your story, it just goes back to showing resilience, strength, self-awareness. And I really do believe that the people who are listening to this today are going to walk away knowing that they can be resilient as well. And resilience is not this one definition of someone being strong or someone doing this. It's being human and learning to keep pushing forward and using your pain to advocate and to really change the way the world is, right? So I want to thank you once again, Yafa,